President Biden has issued an executive order to review Bears Ears and I think a few other national monuments. And I know this is something you've sounded off before on, but what are your thoughts on that and some of the implications relating to that decision?
Yeah, no, thanks for the chance to talk about this. I find it significant that in his inaugural address, President Biden pledged, as he put it, his whole soul to the task of bringing America together, uniting our people and uniting our nation. Sadly, though, just a few hours later, President Biden signed a slew of executive orders, one of which would or could make it next to impossible for him to honor that promise to unite our nation, particularly with respect to the growing divide between rural Americans and their urban counterparts. The Antiquities Act was passed into law about 110 years ago to prevent looting of artifacts, Native American artifacts, most immediately from federal land. But over time, it's morphed into a tool, really, for radical environmentalist activists and wealthy coastal elites who fund them to prevent rural Americans from using public land to provide for their families. And so President Trump undid most of President Obama's executive action with regard to the Bears Ears National Monument, which President Obama created on December 28th, 2016, in the final weeks of his administration. And so President Obama took the first step. President Trump took the second step by significantly redrawing and reducing the footprint of that monument. And now that we've had two significant steps by two different presidents, and we're going into the third president to touch this, I think it's important for us to return to the bargaining table and find a solution. And I think President Biden has an opportunity to take a path of respect and compromise and unity. And I think he should take that path. But if he chooses the other path, that is, if his proposed review of the new Bears Ears National Monument boundaries ignores the majorities of people in Utah and in San Juan County, Utah in particular, it could be perceived and quite fairly, in my view, as sort of a gratuitous act of aggression by the new administration and by rich coastal donors and supporters against the working families of rural Utah and other parts of our country.
Do you think your Senate colleagues will, I don't know if you have intentions to introduce any legislation to address this, because I think kind of with the precedent established with the Antiquities Act, people forget that actually 5 presidents have shrunk national monuments. It's not actually uncommon for presidents to do this, but people like to conveniently ignore that. But with this executive order, would it present opportunities for you and other senators to perhaps craft legislation to modernize the Antiquities Act to prevent, let's say, any usurpation of too big of segments of land? And this goes against, obviously, Section 2 of the law, where I'm merely paraphrasing, but it says that the government can only, or presidents can only designate like small swaths of land for national monuments. So do you anticipate, because of this, maybe there could be a remedy in Congress with this as a result?
I do, and I've already done that. In fact, earlier today, I introduced a piece of legislation to do just that. My first 2 bills were filed today, and one of those deals specifically with the Antiquities Act and would provide that any creation of any new national monument in Utah or any expansion of any existing national monument in Utah can't be done by executive action alone. That it would have to be undertaken with the approval of our legislature and also through a congressional enactment. I've got a number of other pieces of legislation that some of which I've drafted and introduced in previous Congresses that make other broader modifications to it. But this is the first one I've introduced. And I think it's appropriate to review the Antiquities Act right now, especially given that we've just had a change in administration. President Biden has just made this call for unity and made this a real commitment on his part. It's important to remember when you look at we've had two monuments designated by two different Democratic presidents over the last 25 years in Utah, against the will of the local population and of Utah's congressional delegation and governor and state legislature. One was the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, designated by President Clinton in 1996, and the other one was the Bears Ears, which I mentioned a minute ago. It was designated at the end of December in 2016 by President Obama. As originally designated, I believe the Grand Staircase was about 1.9 million acres, and Bears Ears originally was around 1.3 million acres. Those two monuments alone, just those two monuments designated in Utah, take up an amount of land that's larger than two Delawares. And I think that's an appropriate comparison here, given that that's our new president's home state. That's an enormous amount of land, and it's one of the reasons why, given how Utah has been picked on by Democratic presidents, perhaps perceiving that they don't consider themselves likely to win Utah's now 6 electoral votes in any event. This is a way to keep a lot of their environmental activists happy. We've been picked on excessively, and it's not fair. It's yet another reason why Utah should receive some additional protection. Much like Alaska and Wyoming have been legislatively protected from future designations of national monuments under the Antiquities Act.
I suspect some of your critics will see your push to oppose this, and they'll defer back to a speech you gave a few years ago suggesting that you had called them upper crust elites, and they said that you were anti-public lands. How do you respond to those accusations, kind of in the grand scheme of things with the Antiquities Act, and whether or not you have concern? Because it seems like you do have the concerns of your constituents, because I saw the statement from much of the Utah delegation that they don't like this move by President Biden, but some will defer back to your speech and say, well, he doesn't really care about public lands, given his past statements saying that public lands are only for the upper crust elite. So how would you respond to critics who say that perhaps your concern maybe not really is rooted in public lands interests?
First of all, that's an absurd accusation to suggest that I'm opposed to public lands categorically, or to say that I've somehow suggested that public lands are only for upper crust elites. That it is very often upper crust elites who are pushing aggressive action as to federal public lands. It's a very different question from whether public lands have a purpose, which they do. Most of the people, it's always difficult to quantify these things, and so I don't want to say anything that I'm not ready to prove, but I can safely say many of the people who give a lot of money and do a lot of advocacy on what they regard as ideal public lands policy are people who don't live in Utah or in Wyoming or Idaho or Montana or any of the other western states where the federal government owns a significant portion of the land. I'm in favor of having public lands. I think public lands are a good thing. I like national parks. I like, and I'm not categorically opposed to the idea of public lands, but those are different questions from the very narrow question that we're dealing with here. They're also different from the broader question of where there is public land, how much public land should there be in any particular state, and perhaps more importantly, who should own it and manage it? Should it really be owned and managed mostly by people who live and work and exist thousands of miles away from where the land is and away from the people who actually do rely on that land for their existence, have to cross it in order to access their own land that they use for grazing for their animals, or to cross it to access their farms or their ranches? Most people would agree that it's better to have their land use decisions made more by people who are familiar with their land and their circumstances than it is by people who live far away from them. It's also separate and distinct from this precise question that we're dealing with here, which is not public land versus private land. That's really not what we're dealing with when it comes to the designation of national monuments. National monuments are designations within land that is already federally owned. And designating something as a national monument is an act that takes already federal public land and it ratchets it up from one level of control to another. In other words, it's a way of limiting even further the activities that can take place on federal public land, and narrowing even further the group of people who can have input on those decisions. And so that's why it really is just for people who would say that my concerns about national monuments reflect a categorical antipathy toward public lands. It's an unfair argument, because it's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about public versus private in this context. We are talking about what level of restrictions you're going to impose on something. And it can be very fun for people from out of state who want to be part of a cause to say, hey, there's this land in one of the square states back in the Rocky Mountains, and we want to keep people off of it. It makes us feel good to tell ourselves that we're protecting that land, even though it's land that we don't see and we don't live on or nearby, and let's protect it. That can be a lot of fun for people to do from a distance. It's quite another thing for the people who actually live there to endure the consequences of the additional restrictions that come along with the monument designation. And remember that public land, before it becomes public land that is not a national monument, still has a lot of land use restrictions attached to it. They're still very protected. It's not as though we're proposing a free for all on that. That's not the contrast that's accurate here.
Yeah, I appreciate the response to that question, because I think a lot of people will be very curious to see what your true view of public lands is. Not kind of a warped view that I think a lot of people have presented your views as. And I think with respect to national monuments, obviously it's in kind of tier system of public lands, and the more you go up towards a national park or national monument, it does become restrictive. And kind of against opportunities to have multiple uses for different public lands like BLM, Forest Service, and interestingly enough, some critics in fishing and hunting of yours have not really examined some of the implications with national monument designations that actually take out hunters and anglers from access opportunities and access points. There was a really big case of that evidence in Arizona, which we don't really have to go into, but I have identified certain blips in their argument with that. So it is true that sometimes those monument designations do shut out people, and I can understand the Utah delegation feels very concerned with that possible shutting out of opportunities to live off the land or recreate coming from that. And kind of related to the Antiquities Act, the likely incoming Interior Secretary for Biden is actually a really big champion of restoring Bears Ears to the Obama-era levels. She's also indicated support for the Green New Deal and has some pretty extreme positions compared to past Interior Secretaries across both Republican and Democrat administrations. And you sit on the committee that will likely deliberate on her fate, whether or not she gets to be confirmed. How do you anticipate that going? Do you see her being confirmed? Do you have questions for her coming into the committee?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I certainly have questions, as I always will, of any Interior Secretary. As I sit on the committee that will review her nomination. And I look forward to an open, frank conversation with her, and I look forward to hearing how she analyzes this and what, if she does want to advocate for this step, why she thinks that would be a good idea. One of the things that I intend to communicate to her is that I recognize that given the way the law is written, the Obama administration can, as a matter of law, take this step. They've got the ability to do it. And in the absence of a change in law, there's really nothing Utah or its 2 senators, its 4 members of Congress, members of the House, or its governor can do about it. They do have this power. It's one of the reasons why I think the law needs to change. But one of the questions that I intend to ask is, where does it lead? Do they really want, consistent with what President Biden said in his inaugural address, to unite? And if so, do they really want to be the people who come in and take an action that, while popular with some people, will be devastating to many who live on or near this land? Is that what they want? And is it? I also intend to ask them, where will it lead in terms of future support for proposals like some that I've introduced and will continue to introduce? In the long haul, I think aggressive and inconsiderate actions like those that they're contemplating will only fuel efforts like mine to make significant changes to the Antiquities Act and to other laws governing the use of federal public land. So if they really want to do that, I have no doubt that they have the legal authority to do it. But I'm not sure it's really what they want in the end, and we'll find out. And you also go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no problem, Senator Lee. I recall under the Obama years, there was a lot of division and a lot of derision of people out west. It was very heated. I've spoken to numerous people, whether they're clients or people who recreate outfitters, who had said that a lot of kind of caustic rhetoric emanated from Washington, and over the last 4 years, that kind of subsided, and a lot of people are worried about that returning again, if not with a vengeance, under this administration, if they have these plans to pursue kind of this radical preservationist conservation philosophy. And certainly that can be heightened with probably incoming Secretary Haaland's proposals or Biden's agenda. And I wanted to segue into asking you about, let's say, a person that everyone is talking about who will likely take the helms of the committee that you serve in, Senator Joe Manchin. Do you think he'll be a bulwark against some of the radical environmental and climate policies that your Democrat colleagues and now Majority Leader Chuck Schumer are proposing? Do you think he could be possibly a reliable ally for Republicans in the Senate to stop those type of proposals?
Yes, I think so. On a number of issues, I think he will be. Joe is a dear friend. He and I were both elected to the Senate in 2010, and in addition to being a colleague on the committee and in the Senate generally, he's also a personal friend. I have dinner with Joe on a very regular basis, and I think I know that he's got a strong commitment to making sure that the government doesn't hurt people, and that it's in its zeal to achieve this or that political gain, it doesn't do things that make life harder for hardworking Americans.
Yeah, I suspect he may have some clashes with Majority Leader Schumer, given the fact that Schumer put out a statement saying like they're going to go full throttle with all these different climate policies. But that's reassuring to hear, and hopefully he does live up to that. Is there anything else you want to discuss kind of on your mind about natural resources or energy?
Yeah, I was just going to add that to this conversation that one of the things that's important to remember is that in no state east of Colorado, does the federal government own more than 15% of the land. In every state west of Colorado's eastern boundary, the federal government owns at least 15% of the land, and in many of those states like mine, it's a lot more than that. The federal government owns about 2/3 of the land in Utah. And so that's yet, in addition to the fact that we've been repeatedly, our state has repeatedly been the subject of national monument designations. We also, in the absence of reform, are always at risk at having up to 2/3 of our land declared national monument. And so it's short-sighted and inconsiderate on the part of many people, particularly people from states east of Colorado, to sneer at people in states like mine when they don't have anything like this in their state. I mean, just imagine if any particular landowner owned more than, 5 or 10% of the land in any state. If it were a corporate owner or an individual, even a nonprofit, that entity or that person would have a disproportionately large and most would say dangerous hold on that state's economy. Imagine further that owner owned not 15%, but 67% of the land in that state. And finally, imagine that landowner declared itself exempt from tax laws of that state, and that nobody could touch the land, nobody could tax the land without that entity or that person's permission. It would raise anti-competitiveness concerns. If it were a for-profit corporation, it would almost certainly raise antitrust questions, and it would cause a lot of discomfort and a lot of suffering. The fact that this land is owned not by a corporation or a nonprofit or an individual, but instead by a government, doesn't make those issues go away. And in many ways it makes them more severe, especially when you have people acting without due regard or adequate concern for the concentrated, disproportionate burden that they're adding to the people of one state or of one part of that state. In the case of Bears Ears National Monument, Bears Ears National Monument happens to be found entirely within one county, San Juan County, which happens to be the poorest county in the state of Utah. These are very real concerns that I would love to see the Biden administration, in the spirit of unity, starting to take into account.
Yeah, it sounds like a tall order and an interesting time in natural resources there. Yep. But I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule to chat with me about these issues, and hopefully we can continue to talk about them going forward. If I can be a resource in media for you to dispense your thoughts on this, please let me know, and we'll make it happen.
Great. Hey, thanks so much. Good to talk to you. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.